On today's show, the Hawks make a pair of transactions on this Tuesday. Bruno Fernando saying farewell to the Hawks and a bit of a new infusion of talent in the front court. We'll get into all of what transpired, what it all means, and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1776 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Rowland, coming to you late in the night here on Tuesday evening into Wednesday. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. And this summer, they're hooking us all up. Yes, FanDuel is hooking up every customer with a boost or a bonus daily. Something for everyone, every day, all summer long. And the place to go is FanDuel.com to get started. I also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast, as I always do, to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Go ahead and subscribe to this podcast anywhere you might find podcasts on the audio side, including places like Apple and Spotify and Overcast, as well as on YouTube, where you should like this episode as you are watching it. And then also please subscribe to that video-based platform. And it's been a busy day in Hawksland. To take you behind the curtain a little bit, I expected to have to do some sort of kind of emergency podcast, newsy podcast between Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, somewhere because of the inherent deadline that the Hawks are dealing with Bruno Fernando. With that said, Tuesday was earlier than I probably thought was actually going to happen, but on Tuesday afternoon, Shams Charania at The Athletic started the frenzy of reporting and news for the Hawks by putting out there that Bruno Fernando was going to be waived by the Hawks. A few minutes later, I was able to confirm that report, and Bruno's second stint with the Hawks is officially over. He was officially waived shortly after that reporting. I did mention this on the show earlier this week, so I actually did a two-part episode with Glenn Willis of ATL and 29. That show is very relevant still, so please listen to that show right now. Or actually, when we're done with this one, I suppose, we talked about Summer League. We talked about the Olympics. We talked about David Roddy, the newest addition to the Hawks roster before today. And it was a fun conversation, as always, with Glenn. But as part of that, a small part of it, I did mention kind of candidly that, look, if the Hawks didn't make a move before Thursday, I was expecting or projecting the Hawks to waive Bruno. And that's basically what I was saying in short form in different podcasts the last few weeks. Now, they didn't rule that out. The Hawks could have made a different transaction at some point. They actually moved a little bit earlier than they had to. Again, the deadline was Thursday, August 1st. Today is Tuesday, July 30th as they did this. But basically, the Hawks had to make a proactive decision on Bruno. If they didn't waive him, he would have been owed and guaranteed about $2.7 million as of Thursday for the upcoming season. Now, they could have moved him later, could have traded him or whatever, but his deal would have become guaranteed on Thursday. And basically the reason why I thought, well, many reasons, but one of the reasons I thought that they were going to make a move or decision before them is that Bruno would have been the 16th guy on the roster, and you can't have more than 15 guys on the roster. Also, guaranteeing Bruno would have pushed the Hawks, at least for now, above the luxury tax line, where they don't want to be, candidly. Now, the tax line only matters at the end of the season, so they could have gotten out of it, but most teams, not all, but most teams that don't want to pay the tax don't want to start the year in the tax. Which is notable there as well. Plus 15 players is the cap before opening night. So having 16 guys on guaranteed contracts is not ideal. And then, of course, beyond that, you have the positional crunch for the Hawks, which has been a topic for several weeks now since the Hawks added Larry Nance in the DeJounte Murray trade almost a month ago now as we're talking. Basically, they have Capella, they have Okongwu, and they have Larry Nance, all of whom are basically too good to not play. And then you have Cody Zeller, and then you have Mo Gay, who's kind of a 4 mostly, but he can sort of flash as a 5. And as we'll get to later on, the Hawks made another transaction on Tuesday. But anyway, they have this roster crunch at center. All that kind of lends itself to the fact that if they didn't clear some space via something else, Bruno was probably going to be on the chopping block, and that happened. So we'll come back to Bruno and the fallout of that. But I do want to touch on this first. They signed a two-way guy on Tuesday, which I'll talk about now. Woj reported on Tuesday that the Hawks are going to get the final two-way slot to Dominick Barlow, who has been in the sports organization until now. I confirmed that shortly after that. The Hawks announced it about 3 or 4 o'clock Eastern time this afternoon. Barlow is a combo big man. 6'10" in shoes at the combine with 7'3" wingspan, so has center length. Not necessarily like big center size, but certainly enough combo big size. Played some 4, played some 5 with the Spurs. He actually played at Overtime Elite in Atlanta, which of course was notable for that local connection. He just turned 21, despite having 2 years of pro experience, plus Overtime Elite. So he's younger than a lot of guys that were in this draft class just now, just for reference. Again, 2 years in the pro so far. He was actually quite good this last year, but it was pretty good in the G League as a rookie, honestly. But then this year was dominant in the G League. 24 points, 8 rebounds per game, more than a block and a steal per game in 19 G League appearances. Plus, he shot the ball really well, 57% from the field for Barlow in the G League this year. Also played 33 games for the Spurs at the NBA level as a 20-year-old. 13 minutes a game on a bad team, but has some very, very intriguing ball skills and passing skills for a big man. Also didn't turn the ball over very much this last year, which is really encouraging for a 20-year-old big. Rebounding numbers were pretty solid. A career 3.3% block rate in the NBA, which is pretty good for a big. Played mostly backup center, actually, for the Spurs last year, despite the fact that, again, he's kind of combo big size. Like, he's taller than Okongwu, but not, kind of similar height to Capella. Not as bulky as Capella, but like a smaller guy, but has center size, if that makes sense. So, like, I know there's this whole movement of some fans that are like against these smaller centers, but he can play the 4, he can play the 5. Basically what I would say is at this point in time, he is not a real shooter to this point. Now, he took threes in the G League last year, was okay, mixed results there. If he could shoot, he'd already be making real money. Like, that's the one question about his game moving forward. Like, I've asked around in the last few hours since this news broke to people that I trust around the league, whether it's people who work for teams, other media folks, people that cover the Spurs, scouts, etc. And basically everyone that I've talked to, and I'm not kidding, like, I've not heard anybody say a negative thing here. Everyone believes this is a great two-way signing, at the very least. It's a two-way contract, minimal risk, basically no risk whatsoever. I talked to someone who I won't name, who covers the Spurs intensely, who I trust. And he said they basically talked about, like, how much Barlow has improved from year 1 to year 2, especially on defense, which is very notable for that position, especially got stronger. He's bigger and thicker and stronger. Still has some room to fill out. He has a great frame, that length I talked about before with the wingspan. That's notable to me. And also some good recap stuff about him being a hard worker and having a good head on his shoulders for a young guy. That's obviously very what you want to see for a guy who's just turned 21 years old. Also, my friend Sam Vecini of The Athletic wrote this in late June in public. That he wrote that if Barlow was in this 24-24 NBA draft class, he would have been in the top 30 for him in the class. And again, he's draftable age right now. He just turned 21 in May. So if Sam, and yeah, it was not like an in-depth profile, but Sam wrote pretty candidly, if Barlow was in this draft, he would have been a first-round talent. So, like, to get a first-round talent in this class at 21 years old on a two-way at the end of July is just fantastic. So that does not mean that he's going to be awesome. That's obviously too aggressive. It's a developmental project in some respects, but you don't usually get guys who just turned 21 with tangible upside and also some NBA experience, reasonably so, at the end of July on a two-way. So, broadly speaking, we'll have more on him in the future, I'm sure, but I would say this is a great bit of business for the Hawks to have him signed. Like, if they had given Barlow the minimum, I would have been like, cool, that's great. Two ways even more friendly. This is way down the road, but also signing players to two ways. If it works, you have great leverage in the future. So, like, I don't want to use Vít Krejci as an example, but it's a natural one for this summer. Vít got a very, very, very team-friendly contract, in part because he was coming off of a two-way. Same with Barlow. If that were to happen this year, going into next year, if he shows more, that's a lot of ifs, but there's upside in the short term. There's upside in the long term. He's very young. He's very talented. And I talked to a lot of people today. No one that I talked to was like, why do they do that? Why do they do that? Obviously, this is going to help you a lot this year. Two ways. There's, as I always say, there's two different kinds of two-way contracts. There's guys who are a little bit older who are going to help you kind of plug a hole right now. Then there are these younger developmental guys who can help you in the future, maybe a little bit now. Barlow kind of does both. Like, he's not older, but he played real minutes last year in the NBA. So, like, that's a possibility that he could help you on the line if you need depth. If you end up trading someone in the front court, or if you get 2 injuries, he might be able to play for you now if you need him to. And then long term, this is a guy with real tools. So that's all I have on that front at the moment. But there was this 2-pronged transactional cycle on Tuesday. Bruno, the farewell there, adding a guy at Barlow who was really, really intriguing that we'll get into even more in the future. So that's what happened. I'm going to get into kind of what's happening around Bruno and kind of what's happening there, like as far as like what's interesting, what's notable, what it all means, etc. But first, we're from our partners on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It's summertime, means baseball, basketball, and much more. You can bet it all at FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and this summer, they're hooking us all up. Yes, all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. Something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Bet on all of your favorite players and teams with quick bets and live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and much more. They have all the stuff you're looking for across the board. Plus, it's really easy to use. They have over-unders, point spreads, money lines, player props, future bets, live betting, etc., etc. And they also have this really safe and secure app platform, and they also cover the entire range of sports as well. That includes the NBA, of course, as you're listening to this podcast, WNBA stuff, NFL, college football, Olympics, across the board. Lots of Olympic stuff at FanDuel, plus MLB, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, boxing, MMA, and many more sports. And now is an awesome time. Sign up with the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook, and the place to go is FanDuel.com to get started. One more time, just visit FanDuel.com to get started right now. Start making the most out of your summer with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, so some of this is like some almost mailbag style. Like I got some questions, some very natural topics about why Bruno was waived, the fallout, the impact. Again, a lot of this happened before the Barlow move. And by the way, they're not related. I know there are similar positions, but I think if the Hawks were going to keep Bruno, they still would have signed Don Barlow. Like Barlow being available for a two-way contract, just to say that out loud, you do that every time, in my opinion. Like positionally, I know there's this log jam, quote unquote, at center that does not stop you from signing the best player available. And I truly think Barlow was the best guy available who was two-way eligible that the Hawks could have signed. And I'm not saying that I looked today. I tried to find someone else that I would have liked more. Couldn't find anybody. So pretty good sign there. Anyway, one topic was Bruno Fernando against Cody Zeller. If you don't know this by now, Cody Zeller is on the team. He was part of the DeJounte Murray trade. He was signed and traded by the Pelicans to make the money work. He's owed $3.5 million this year. So the big domino here in the Fernando versus Zeller thing is that Zeller is on a guaranteed contract. So if the Hawks were to cut Cody Zeller, A, they have to pay him, and B, that money counts against the cap and it counts against the tax. This is not other sports maybe different. Very important thing here. People keep missing this in conversations like, why can't they just cut Cody Zeller? They can cut him if they want to, but they got to pay him, and that money does not go away off their books. Keep that in mind. That's the biggest thing. Well, whereas the Hawks could waive Bruno with $0 paid. Now, that's brutal for Bruno, of course, but from a team standpoint, that is the biggest single reason why the Hawks waived Bruno Fernando today, is that I believe Bruno is better than Cody Zeller. He's younger. He's got more juice. You know, there's different stuff about Bruno. Like, for instance, there's this category of Hawks fan that I hear from sometimes that like thinks Bruno is like awesome. I don't know if I go that far. I think Bruno is a solid player. He is better than Cody Zeller at this point in time. But it really is as simple as that. If Zeller was non-guaranteed, and so was Bruno, I believe they would have kept Bruno. But Zeller, they already have to pay and commit to, and that's why this is happening. So this is the kind of thing in the NBA that happens sometimes. Roster machinations, cap machinations play into what ends up happening. Fernando's deal was quite team-friendly, and it ended up actually biting him in this instance because Bruno, as I've said many times, is, in my opinion, a guy who's a really good third center on a team. If he's your backup center, you're not feeling great about it. If he's your third center, you're totally fine with that. But the Hawks have, three guys who are better than him, very clearly better than him. Capella, Okongwu, and Nance are all notably better than Bruno. And then you have the fourth guy in Zeller, who's on a guaranteed contract. And that makes Bruno the fifth guy. And yeah, if they kept him, he would have been the fourth guy to Zeller, I think. But you can't really justify having five centers under contract. And yeah, Nance and Okongwu can play a little bit at the four, but most of those guys are all centers. And then you throw in Mo Gay. You throw in Jalen, all this stuff. Like, that's not a great roster allocation. That's where we are now. Now, I will say this. You could at least question the Hawks' handling of the margins of the Murray trade. If you listen to the show for a while, you will know I like the Murray trade a lot. I was high on it when it happened. I think that they got a good return for DeJounte. They got good value, and they kind of had to change something in the backcourt between Trey and DeJounte. It just didn't work. That's not an indictment of either player. They're both very good. Just what it is. It didn't work. So I like Daniels a lot, of course. The two picks, a valuable player in Nance. But there is an argument that the Hawks just taking Cody Zeller in to make the money work is not the greatest process move. They could have maybe weaved the deal in with Valanciunas or something like that. Now, in theory, I'd rather have Bruno at his contract than Zeller at $3.5 million. It isn't always that easy, though. It's fair to bring that up, and I won't criticize people bringing that. That does make sense to me. Like, yeah, it would be great for me personally. If they didn't have Zeller on the roster, that would be better, in my opinion. But that's the way they had to do the deal in the end. I would also note this. The Hawks did manage to turn the John Collins trade exception into another huge exception for Murray, which would have been hard to do without taking Zeller. So, like, that's maybe why they did that in the end. So it's not all bad. Anyway, they have a $20+ million exception that they might use at some point in time for DeJounte. But in the end, I know this is not a huge topic for everybody. I understand that. But people just see Bruno as the guy that they like and Zeller as the guy they don't like. And I get it because Bruno's better than him. I will say that. Plus, I just like Bruno. Everyone likes Bruno. I get it. But it's all procedural. Once Zeller was on a guaranteed contract and Bruno wasn't, there just was going to have to be something else that happened. Like if the Hawks had traded Nance or if the Hawks traded Capella, you could have kept Bruno. But in the end, that hasn't happened yet. The Hawks clearly, by the way, did not want to cut Bruno. There's a very logical placement of that. Like I heard that and also just the way they did it. Because if the Hawks wanted to cut Bruno, they would have cut Bruno a month ago. His first guarantee date was June 29th. They didn't want to cut him. So they went to Bruno and said, all right, we want to keep you, but let's push it back together. Push it back 2 weeks. Again, in mid-July, same thing. They didn't want to cut him. If they wanted to cut him, they would have done it. They didn't want to. But in the end, nothing else materialized. They had to cut the, well, quote unquote, had to cut the money because of the tax. Roster decisions out there. They have a full roster, et cetera. And that's why we are where we are right now. So the other big thing, of course, is where the Hawks are at this stage, roster-wise, whether they're done or not. And there are some factors to consider there, to be sure. Broadly speaking, I do believe the Hawks could be done right now and roll with this roster. I will explore that in a second. But first, a word from our partners on today's podcast. All right, as far as where we are, as far as the Hawks are concerned on their roster, they have 15 guys under contract. That's a full roster right now, plus all 3 two-way slots are now full when you include Barlow to go along with Seth Lundy and Keaton Wallace. The tax line is about $170.8 million. Currently, the Hawks have $169.5. So they're about $1.3 million under the tax with 15 guys on the roster. That includes Garrison Matthews, who I've been saying the whole time I expect to be on the team. Technically not guaranteed in his contract, but everyone's functioning like that's going to be guaranteed. So there you go. They do have, again, $1.3 million in breathing room, though Hunter and Capella do have some incentives to monitor, which we'll get into down the line sometime. But they are under the tax. And now I've been saying this for a long time, so forgive me, but there's been a widespread thought, expectation, however you want to put that the Hawks will be under the tax. They are right now. They have a legal roster. It's under the tax. And that is notable because the Hawks want to be under the tax. They might say otherwise on the record in interviews. The Hawks have operated like a team for the last 3 or 4 years that does not want to pay the luxury tax. And it's not a coincidence that they end up close to the line and not over it. That's not a coincidence. All right. Now, they have the center crunch, right? I mentioned it earlier, but I don't think anyone would say with a straight face that it's perfect to have Capella, Okongwu, and Nance all on the team. I also would say it isn't perfect to have those 3 guys plus Cody Zeller, plus Mo Gay, plus Barlow in a two-way, etc. It did a little bit of cleanup here because EJ Liddell was much more of a front court player than David Roddy, who's kind of more of a hybrid forward type. Liddell is almost a center in some ways, given the way he plays defensively. So that was a little bit more of a lean away from center, but they still have 4 definite centers, plus Mo Gay, and then plus Don Barlow now on the two-way. Out of the highly paid centers, the 3 of them, Nance and Okongwu can at least play a little bit at the 4, like maybe fake it a little bit, but they're both centers, I think, especially Okongwu. Now, it's tough to play all 3 of the centers because you kind of have to play somebody at the 4 sometimes. Maybe you can play Nance and Okongwu together. We'll explore that a little bit closer to the season if we need to, but it isn't ideal, although it is doable. And the Hawks, in my opinion, can, I'm not saying they should, but they can keep them together and function. Nance can play some 4. Capella has been durable in recent years. He's played 63 games or more in 4 straight seasons. So it's not like a question of that, but he could be reduced playing time-wise as he gets older. Maybe sit some back-to-backs, maybe a little bit less. Obviously, there's this whole debate that I won't get into now, but who's going to start between Okongwu and Capella. put that aside for now. They could play Capella less, both in games played, monitoring his minutes, keeping him fresh, etc. Then you have Okongwu, who's had well-documented injury issues. He's played more than 55 games in only one of his 4 seasons in the NBA. He had the toe issue at the end of last season. He was still banged up as of a few weeks ago. I think he'll be fine for training camp, but like, you can't assume Okongwu at this point is going to play 70 games. You just can't assume that. He might play it. He might do it, but you can't assume it. And then, of course, they're not like committed to Nance in a big way. Like, I think he's a valuable rotation player. Personally, I like Nance a lot, but he wasn't like the centerpiece of the trade for Murray. He can handle a smaller role. If Capella and Okongwu are healthy, he can handle that. I will say, I don't think Nance is going to be thrilled to be like the third center, like firmly the third center. So like, if he's on the team and Okongwu and Capella are healthy, you might have to just play Nance at the 4 some. I'm sure there's been a conversation about that at some point behind the scenes. So that's why I go back to say, like, I don't think it's ideal to have all 3 of these guys, but it is doable. If you manage it the right way, you have an experienced coach that people trust in Quinn Snyder. You have 3 guys who people, I think, have a high regard for in Okongwu, Capella, and Nance as far as like guys in the locker room. No issues there with those 3 guys. So like, it's not great, but it's doable, and depth is an important thing. So there's that. Now, all that said, I am not saying the Hawks are definitely done with their roster right now. I'm not saying that. I do think they're going to listen continually on Nance, on Capella, on Hunter, etc. I think the big stuff is probably done. Like, I think guys like Trey and Bogey and Jalen and the young guys are going to stay on the roster. It would not stun me in August if somebody on a team somewhere was like, you know what, we need another big. We're going to trade for Larry Nance. Nance fits in the mid-level on some teams. It's easier to trade him than Capella because of the money. He makes less money. But Capella and Nance are both on expiring contracts, which makes things easier for all parties. Also, it makes it easier to keep them. That's the other thing, though. Easier to trade them, yes, but also easier to keep them because at the end of the season, the money doesn't carry over. So there's that. Most deals, though, do not happen in August and September. There are some stuff around the league, like marketing. There's some buzz about like the first week of August. Doesn't really impact the Hawks necessarily. Like, although I guess it could at some point. But most, and I would say the vast majority of the business of the NBA is done for the summer. There are some guys who are still out there in free agency. Isaac Okoro is out there in free agency. Markelle Fultz. Like there's names that are out there still, plus trades. But if you're betting, it's always smarter to bet on a deal not happening in August or September than a deal actually happening. But maybe there'll be a multi-team deal the Hawks get into as a facilitator. Maybe a team gets an injury, needs a fill-in in the front court. Stuff can happen. But what I am saying is it would not be at all shocking to me at this point if the Hawks just went into the season with this general roster. There's one thing they have to do still. One thing. And that is Nikola Jurisic has nowhere to go at this point. So Jurisic, second-round pick from the Hawks, got hurt in Summer League, broke his foot, going to be out for several months. At the same time, he had 3 chances, like 3 pathways, I should say, to a contract. Second round picks can use be able to get multi-year contract. They could be on a 2-way. He can also be stashed overseas. The 2-way option is no longer an option. They have 3 guys on 2-ways. And the full contract option is not an option right now because they have a full roster. So what I would not say that I've seen out there today from some people in Hawksland, I would not say that this is definitely going to be a stash for Jurisic now. What I would say is it's more likely than it's ever been because they don't have as much flexibility. Also, he's hurt, and we'll see. But he might be overseas, but that is the one thing that they have to kind of figure out in the next 2 months before camp opens, media day opens. Everything else, they can kind of sit on their hands if they want to. But they have a legal roster right now, 15 guys, under the tax. It's a roster that's competitive. It's interesting. I did a little bit last week about like the over-unders. I think the Hawks are an over team right now. They're better than people think they're going to be. They're not going to be the Celtics. I understand that. Like they're not going to be a title contender this year with this roster, but they're competitive. They're interesting. I'm interested in them, but that's where they are roster-wise. I'll have more on that in the future, obviously. But yeah, that's kind of where we are. They of course, Bruno's farewell. Where I'll leave the podcast actually is that, look, this stinks for Bruno. Everyone, and I'm not kidding, everyone loves Bruno Fernando. Everyone around the Hawks. I'm sure this is painful for them. They don't want to have to do this. They like Bruno Fernando as a guy, as a player too, but especially as a guy. He's a great locker room guy. He works hard. He's an NBA player. Like, I think he's clearly an NBA player. Clearly. Like, he's not great, but he's a third center, backup on a bad team, whatever you want to say. He should be in the NBA somewhere. I hope he finds a team quickly, and I'll be rooting for Bruno. I like him a lot. But there you go. That's the breakdown of where the Hawks are right now. All the angles here. I'm sure I'll answer some questions about this on a show in the coming days and weeks. We'll have more with Glenn Willis on the player capsules. I have some guests lined up. I'm sure I'll talk to Howard Jones to come back with me on pretty soon. And we're basically 2 months now from Media Day. So this is the slowest time of the year. This is the one transaction that had to get settled other than Jurisic, but the one roster guy that had to get settled. Now it's settled. So like it's smooth sailing a little bit here from now until camp, but I don't leave. I do podcasts all summer long. So please stay tuned to this podcast. Please tell your friends about the show. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple, on Spotify, on Overcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this episode right now. I'm begging you to go ahead and do that. Also, please subscribe on YouTube as well and tell your friends. Follow the show on Twitter /X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there as well at BT Rowland. Also, you can follow my written work at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I really appreciate everyone listening to the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday into Thursday. We'll be back at some point later on this week. And we'll see you all next time.